The crystal spires of Volanthos Prime touched the purple sky like fingers reaching for the stars, and the grand hall of the royal palace shone with light that came from within the walls themselves. It was the most beautiful place in the known galaxy, or so the Volanthi believed. And on this night, it was filled with thousands of their kind gathered for a ceremony that happened only once every 100 years. Princess Alindra Velshora stood at the top of the crystal staircase and looked down at her people with her 4 silver eyes, her luminescent skin glowing soft blue in the way of her royal bloodline. She was tall and graceful like all Volanthi, with limbs that seemed too long and too thin by the standards of most species. And her movements flowed like water. Even when she stood still tonight was her coming-of-age ceremony, the night she would officially become heir to the dominion that her family had ruled for 10,000 years. And every noble house had sent representatives to witness this moment. The hall was filled with the soft music of thought harps and the gentle hum of telepathic conversation that passed between minds, like whispers on the wind. Her father, Emperor Velthorin, stood beside her in robes of woven starlight, and his ancient face showed pride as he looked upon his only daughter. He had lived for 3,000 years and had seen empires rise and fall across the galaxy, but he had never seen times as dangerous as these. The Skarm were coming. Everyone in the hall knew it, even though no one spoke of it aloud. The insectoid horrors had already consumed 12 worlds on the edge of Volanthi space, and their hunger showed no signs of stopping. The Volanthi had no army, no weapons, no warriors. They had evolved beyond such primitive things thousands of years ago. Or so they had always told themselves. That was why the coalition had sent them. Alindra felt a ripple of unease pass through the crowd before she saw the reason for it, and she turned her attention to the great doors at the far end of the hall. The doors were opening, and through them came something that made every Volanthi in the room take a step backward in instinctive fear. Humans, there were only 5 of them, but they seemed to fill the doorway with their presence in a way that defied their small number. They wore dark armor that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and they carried weapons on their backs and hips that looked brutal and ugly compared to the elegant curves of Volanthi architecture. They walked in formation with a precision that spoke of countless hours of training, and their boots made hard sounds against the crystal floor that echoed through the suddenly silent hall. At their head walked a man who made Alindra forget to breathe. He was not tall by Volanthi standards, barely reaching the shoulder of the shortest noble in the room, but he moved with a weight that had nothing to do with physical size. His skin was a warm brown color, dark compared to the pale luminescence of her people, and it was marked with scars that told stories of violence survived. His hair was cut short and practical, his jaw was square and strong, and his eyes swept the room with a cold assessment that missed nothing. Those eyes found her for a moment that stretched into eternity. Alindra stared into eyes the color of Earth's forests, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Her twin hearts, which had beaten in perfect rhythm for her entire life, suddenly stumbled over each other like clumsy dancers. She had read about humans in her studies, had seen images and recordings, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of standing in the same room as one. He was terrifying. He was beautiful. He was everything her people were not, and she could not look away. The lead human stopped at the base of the crystal staircase and performed a bow that was correct but clearly unfamiliar to him. And when he spoke, his voice was deep and rough, like stones grinding together. Sergeant Marcus Cole of Earth's Diplomatic Security Division, he said, and the words came out flat and hard in the translator's rendering. We are here at the request of the Galactic Coalition to provide security consultation for the Volanthi Dominion. Emperor Velthorin inclined his head in acknowledgement, but Alindra could feel her father's discomfort radiating through their familial bond. He did not want these creatures here any more than the rest of the court did, but desperation had forced his hand. "You are welcome in our hall, Sergeant Cole," the Emperor said, and his voice carried the musical quality that all Volanti speech possessed. "We thank Earth for answering our petition." Murmurs passed through the crowd, spoken and unspoken, and Alindra caught fragments of thought that were not meant for her. Words like primitive and beast and deathworlder flickered at the edges of her perception, and she saw how her people looked at the humans with a mixture of fear and disgust. She understood why. Humans came from a world that the galaxy called a death world, a planet so hostile that survival required becoming a predator. Their history was written in blood and fire, an endless record of wars and conquests and violence that made the Volanti recoil in horror. They were not elegant or refined or peaceful. They were the opposite of everything her civilization valued, and yet they had come when called. The ceremony continued, but Alindra found it impossible to focus on the ancient words and ritual gestures. Her attention kept drifting back to the human sergeant who had taken position near one of the walls with his squad. He stood perfectly still with his hands clasped behind his back, and his eyes never stopped moving. He was watching everything and everyone, cataloging threats and escape routes and tactical positions in a hall that had never known violence. When their eyes met again across the crowded room, he did not look away, and neither did she. The ceremony ended with the traditional blessing of starlight, and the crowd began to shift and move as nobles sought refreshment and conversation. Alindra was supposed to mingle with her future subjects, to accept their congratulations and listen to their petitions. But she found herself moving in a different direction entirely. She was halfway across the hall before she realized she was walking toward the humans. Her handmaidens followed in distress, whispering urgent warnings through their mental link, but she ignored them. She had never done anything so improper in her entire life, and she did not understand what force was driving her forward. Only that she could not stop. Sergeant Cole saw her coming and straightened almost imperceptibly, and she noticed how his hand moved slightly toward the weapon at his hip before stopping. It was an automatic response, she realized, a reflex born of a life where danger could come from anywhere at any time. She stopped a few feet away from him and felt the eyes of the entire court burning into her back. "Sergeant Cole," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I am Princess Alindra. I wanted to welcome you personally to Volanthos Prime." His expression did not change, but something flickered in those green eyes that she could not identify. "Your Highness," he said, and his bow was just as stiff as before. "Thank you for the welcome. It's a beautiful world you have here. You have seen much of the galaxy," she said, and it was not a question. She could see the truth of it written on his skin in scar tissue. "Is it truly so beautiful compared to other places?" He was silent for a moment, and she thought she saw surprise cross his features before it was gone. "I've seen a lot of places, Your Highness," he said finally. "Most of them were on fire at the time. So yeah, this is pretty nice." Before she could respond, an alarm began to scream. The alarm cut through the grand hall like a blade through silk, and for one frozen moment, nobody moved. The Volanthi had never heard this sound before, had never needed to, and their confusion was written on their luminescent faces in patterns of flickering light. Sergeant Marcus Cole did not hesitate. He was already moving before the first scream echoed off the crystal walls, his hand closing around Alindra's wrist with a grip that was firm but not painful. He pulled her behind him as his other hand drew the weapon from his hip, and she found herself staring at his armor back as chaos erupted around them. "Contact south entrance," one of his soldiers shouted through a communication device. "Multiple hostiles, Skarn configuration. They're already inside." The words meant nothing to Alindra, but the fear that gripped her hearts needed no translation. The Skarn were here, in her home, in the most sacred hall of her civilization. This could not be happening. This was impossible, and then she saw them, They poured through the shattered doorway like a tide of nightmares made flesh, their chitinous bodies clicking and scraping against each other as they moved. They had too many legs and too many eyes, and their mandibles dripped with something that hissed when it touched the crystal floor. Each one was the size of a Volanthe, but where her people were graceful. These creatures were built for one purpose, only killing the Volanthe guards. Dressed in ceremonial armor that had never seen real combat, rushed forward to meet the threat. They were brave, Alindra realized with a surge of pride, even knowing they had no chance. But bravery was not enough against enemies who had evolved for war. The first guard died before he could raise his weapon. The second managed one shot before a scarm blade opened his throat. The third and fourth fell together, their bodies crumpling to the floor like discarded flowers. "Get the royal family to the safe room," Marcus shouted to his squad. "I'll hold the corridor. Go now." One of the human soldiers, a woman with short red hair and hard eyes, grabbed the Emperor's arm and began pulling him toward a side passage. Another soldier did the same with the Empress, while the remaining two formed a protective circle around the fleeing nobles. Marcus stayed where he was, placing himself between the advancing Skarn and his charges like a wall of flesh and determination. "You must come with us," Alindra said, and she hated how her voice trembled. "There are too many. You cannot fight them alone." Marcus looked back at her for just a moment, and something in his expression made her hearts ache in a way she did not understand. "I'm not planning to fight them alone." "Your Highness," he said, and there was no fear in his voice, only a cold certainty that sent shivers down her spine. "I'm planning to kill them. Now go." He pushed her toward the side passage, and the red-haired soldier caught her arm and pulled her into the darkness. The last thing she saw before the corridor swallowed her was Marcus, Cole walking toward the Skarn with his weapon raised and his shoulders set. A single human against a tide of monsters. She heard the fighting even from deep within the passage. The sharp crack of human weapons, the shrieking of wounded Skarn, and something else beneath it all. A sound that she would later learn was a human battle cry. Raw and primal and terrifying in its intensity. The safe room was a vault of reinforced crystal deep beneath the palace. And Alindra found her parents already there when she arrived. Her mother was weeping silently, her glow flickering with distress, and her father stood rigid with his hands clasped behind his back. They were alive, and for that she was grateful. But her thoughts kept returning to the grand hall above, the human soldiers. She said to the red-haired woman who had brought her here, "Where are the rest of your people?" The soldier's face was grim as she checked her weapon and moved to guard the door. "Cole ordered us to get you out," she said. "He's buying us time, alone against all of those creatures," Alindra demanded, and her voice rose higher than she intended. "That is suicide?" The soldier looked at her with eyes that had seen too much death to be surprised by anything. "Yeah," she said simply. "That's the job." Time passed in agonizing silence. The sounds of battle above grew distant, then closer, then distant again. 3 times they heard movement in the corridor outside, and 3 times the human soldiers raised their weapons and prepared to fight. 3 times the movement passed without incident, and then the door opened, and Marcus Cole staggered through. He was covered in blood, some of it red and human, most of it green and scarred. His armor was torn in a dozen places, and she could see wounds beneath that made her stomach turn. One arm hung at an angle that could not be natural, and he walked with a limp that spoke of damage she could not see, but he was walking behind. Him lay a corridor filled with scarm bodies, too many to count, piled on top of each other like cordwood. They were dead, all of them killed by a single human with nothing but his weapons and his will to survive. Made it 3 steps into the safe room before his legs gave out. Alindra caught him before he hit the floor. And she could not think about propriety or protocol or the 1,000 rules that governed how a princess should behave. She just held him, feeling the heat of his blood seeping through her ceremonial gown. feeling the weight of him against her body, feeling the way his breath came in ragged gasps against her neck. "The palace is secure," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "My team took out the rest of them. The threat is neutralized." "You fool," she said, and she was crying now, her tears falling onto his scarred face like silver rain. "You absolute fool. You could have died." He looked up at her with those forest green eyes, and she saw pain there, and exhaustion, and something else that made her heart beat faster despite everything. "Didn't though," he said, and one corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "We're stubborn like that." He passed out in her arms, and she held him while the medics came, refusing to let go even when they needed to treat his wounds. She had known this human for less than an hour, had exchanged barely a dozen words with him, but in that short time he had thrown himself between her and death without hesitation. Her people called humans deathworlders, monsters, beasts. They whispered about the violence in human blood and the darkness in human hearts. They looked at Marcus Cole and his kind with fear and disgust, seeing only the scars and the weapons and the capacity for destruction. Alindran looked at him and saw something else entirely. She saw a guardian, she saw a protector, she saw someone who would walk into impossible odds and come out the other side through sheer refusal to die, not for glory or gold or power, but simply because someone needed protecting. The medics worked through the night, using technology that the Volanti had developed for healing ceremonial scratches and minor accidents. They had no experience with wounds like these, with the brutal damage that combat inflicted on flesh and bone. But they learned quickly, because they had to when morning came and the purple sun rose over a palace scarred by violence. Marcus was still unconscious but stable. His wounds were healing faster than anyone expected, and the medics spoke in amazed whispers about the resilience of human. Physiologia sat beside his bed and watched him breathe, and she thought about everything she had believed about the galaxy and the creatures in it. The Skarn attack had been a probe, the first scouts of an invasion fleet that was still coming. Her world was not safe, her people were not prepared, and everything she had known was about to change. But one thing had already changed. She had seen a human fight for her people, bleed for her people, nearly die for her people who had looked at him with contempt and called him a beast, and she would never see them the same way again. 3 weeks had passed since the night of blood and crystal, and Volantos Prime was no longer the peaceful world it had been before. Human ships now orbited alongside Volanti vessels in the purple sky, and human soldiers walked the streets of the capital in numbers that would have seemed impossible just a month ago. The Galactic Coalition had moved quickly after the assassination attempt. Earth had sent 2,000 of its warriors to defend the Volanti homeworld, along with advisors and trainers and engineers who worked alongside Alindra's people to prepare for the war that everyone knew was coming. Sergeant Marcus Cole, now recovered from his wounds though new scars had joined the old ones on his body, had been promoted and given a new assignment. By order of the Emperor himself, he was to serve as the personal protector of Princess Alindra for the duration of the crisis. The court had whispered in outrage at this decision. To place a human so close to the heir was unprecedented, improper, perhaps even dangerous. But the Emperor had seen the same thing his daughter had seen in the Grand Hall that night, and he had made his choice. Yellinger was not unhappy with it. "Tell me about Earth," she said on the 5th day of their strange arrangement. They were walking in the palace gardens, surrounded by flowers that sang in frequencies most species could not hear, and Marcus walked beside her with his eyes constantly scanning for threats. "What do you want to know, Your Highness?" he asked, and his voice was as flat and careful as it always was when he spoke to her. "Everything," she said. "Your world is a mystery to my people. We know only that it is dangerous and that your kind evolved through violence. We know nothing of what it is really like." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. And she had learned in their short time together that this meant he was thinking carefully about his answer. "Earth is dangerous," he said finally. "That part is true. We have predators that can kill with a single bite and weather that can destroy cities in minutes. We have diseases that have killed millions and earthquakes that swallow towns whole. Everything on our world is trying to kill us, and everything on our world is also trying to survive." He paused beside a flower that glowed soft gold, and she saw something change in his expression. Something softer than she had seen before. "But it's all so beautiful," he continued. "We have oceans so big you can sail for weeks without seeing land, and mountains so tall they touch the clouds. We have forests where the trees are older than your civilization, and deserts that burn like fire under twin suns. We have art and music and stories that we've been telling since before we could write them down." "It sounds like a contradiction," Alindra said softly. "That's because it is," Marcus replied. And for the first time she heard something like warmth in his voice. "Humans are contradictions. We write poetry and we wage war. We build hospitals and we build weapons. We can be the cruelest creatures in the galaxy and the kindest. Sometimes in the same breath." He looked at her then, and she felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. "That's what your people don't understand about us," he said. "They see the violence and they think that's all we are. They don't see that we choose violence only when we have to, and that we'd rather be doing almost anything else." "Then why do you fight?" she asked. "Why come here to bleed for people who look at you like you are monsters?" The question hung in the air between them, and she wondered if she had gone too far. But Marcus did not seem offended. He seemed thoughtful, and when he answered, his voice was quiet. "Because someone has to," he said. "Because your people can't, and the scarm won't stop just because you wish they would. Because the galaxy is full of species who evolved past violence and forgot that sometimes violence is necessary. And because humans remember what it's like to be prey, to be hunted, to face extinction. And we decided a long time ago that we would never let that happen again to anyone." The days turned into weeks, and Alindra found herself seeking out Marcus's company more and more. She told herself it was because she was curious about humans, because understanding their protectors would help her people. But she knew in her heart that the truth was simpler and more complicated at the same time. She was falling for him. It was absurd, impossible, improper in every way that mattered. She was a princess of a civilization that had ruled the stars for 10,000 years, and he was a soldier from a species that had barely left its home planet. Her people lived for millennia, and his would be lucky to see a single century. There was nothing about them that should fit together. Nothing that made sense, and yet when he smiled, which was rare and precious, she felt light in ways she had never experienced before. And when he spoke about Earth with that soft look in his eyes, she wanted to see it for herself. And when he stood between her and danger, she felt safer than she had ever felt in her entire life. The crisis came at a state dinner 3 weeks after the assassination attempt. Safer than she had ever felt in her entire life. The crisis came at a state dinner 3 weeks after the assassination attempt. The Lanthi nobles had gathered to discuss strategy with the human commanders. And the conversation had turned, as it always did, to the differences between their species. A lord named Veltaris, who had opposed the human presence from the beginning, had drunk too much ceremonial wine and decided to make his opinions known. "We should be grateful, I suppose," he said loudly enough for the entire hall to hear. "The beasts from Earth have come to protect us. How fortunate that we have such useful animals at our disposal." The room went silent. Marcus stood against the wall in his usual position, and his expression did not change. He had heard worse, Alindra realized, had probably heard it 100 times on a dozen different worlds. He was going to let it pass because that was what he had been trained to do. She was not Lord Veltaris, Alindra said, and her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You speak of beasts and animals, but I wonder if you remember who saved this palace 3 weeks ago. I wonder if you remember who fought and bled while you cowered in a shelter. I wonder if you remember that these animals came here to die for us when no one else in the galaxy would." The Lord's glow flickered with shock and embarrassment, and the entire court stared at their princess with expressions of disbelief. "These humans are not our servants or our tools," Alindra continued. "They are our allies, our protectors, and our teachers. They have shown more courage and honor in their short lives than many of us have shown in our 1,000 years. And I will not stand here and listen to them be insulted in my presence." She turned to Marcus, who was looking at her with an expression she could not read. "Sergeant Cole, you have my apologies on behalf of the Volanthi court," she said formally. "Such words are unworthy of my people." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and then he spoke in a voice that only she was close enough to hear. "You didn't have to do that, Your Highness." "Yes," she said, and she met his eyes without hesitation. "I did." Later, when the dinner had ended and the scandal had spread through every noble house on the planet, Marcus found her in the garden where they often walked. The twin moons hung low in the purple sky, and the singing flowers had gone quiet for the night. "That was risky," he said. "Politically, I mean. You made enemies tonight." "I made them see the truth," she replied. "Whether they accept it is their choice. And what is the truth, Your Highness?" She turned to face him, and she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "The truth is that my people have forgotten how to fight," she said. "We evolved past violence, or so we told ourselves. But evolution is not always progress. Sometimes it is just forgetting. We forgot that the galaxy is dangerous, that peace must be defended, that survival requires strength." She stepped closer to him, close enough to feel the heat that radiated from his body. "The truth is that you remind us of what we lost," she said. "And I do not know if my people will ever forgive you for it. But I am grateful, Marcus. More grateful than I know how to say." It was the first time she had used his name without his title, and she saw his eyes widen slightly at the intimacy of it. "The Skarn fleet will be here in 2 days," he said, and his voice was rougher than before. "When the fighting starts, things are going to get bad. I need you to promise me that you'll stay safe." "I cannot promise that," she said. "But I can promise that I will fight beside my people, whatever comes. And I can promise that I will not forget what you have done for us. What your people have done for us, no matter how this ends." The stars turned overhead, and somewhere in the darkness of space, the Skarn Armada was drawing closer. But in that moment, in the garden of singing flowers under the purple sky, there was only the two of them and the understanding that had grown between them. The war was coming, but they would face it together. The sky above Valantos Prime turned red with fire as the Skarn fleet dropped out of hyperspace, and for one terrible moment, it seemed like the stars themselves had come to burn the world. There were thousands of ships, more than anyone had expected, more than the Coalition scouts had reported, and they blocked out the light of the purple sun as they descended in the command center beneath the palace. Alindra stood beside her father and watched the displays with twin hearts that had forgotten how to beat properly. The human admiral, a woman named Chun with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen 100 battles, was giving orders in a voice that never wavered. "All ships to defensive positions," she commanded. "Fighter squadrons launch on my mark. Ground forces prepare for orbital bombardment and possible landing assault. This is what we trained for. People, let's show these bugs what happens when they pick a fight with Earth." The human fleet was small compared to the Skarn Armada, only a few hundred ships against thousands, but they moved with a precision and aggression that made the Volanthi. Officers gasped in disbelief. They did not wait to be attacked. They charged forward into the enemy formation. Weapons blazing, shields flickering, Crew screaming battle cries into their communications channels. The first Skarn ship exploded 3 minutes into the battle, and then another, and another. The humans fought like demons, like nightmares given form, and they died in their ships with their hands on their weapons and curses on their lips. They knew they could not win this battle, Alendra realized, but they were fighting anyway, buying time with their lives so that the civilians below could reach the shelters. "Where is Sergeant Cole?" she asked, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "Captain Cole has been assigned to the Ground Defense Force," Admiral Chun replied without looking away from the displays. "He's leading a counter-assault team to retake the Northern Shield." Generator. The Skarn dropped troops there 20 minutes ago. The Northern Shield generator was the key to the capital's defense. Without it, the Skarn could bombard the city from orbit and kill millions. Marcus was not just fighting for territory. He was fighting for every life in the capital. Alendra made a decision. "I need a communication link to his team," she said. Now, the Emperor turned to look at his daughter with surprise on his ancient face. But he did not object. He had seen the way she looked at the human soldier, had seen the way the human soldier looked at her, and he was old enough to know that some things could not be stopped. The link connected, and she heard the sounds of battle. Weapons fire, screaming, explosions, and through it all the voice of Marcus Cole shouting orders to his soldiers. "Cole here," he said when her signal came through. "Your Highness, this isn't a good time." "I know," she said. "I needed to hear your voice. I needed to know you were alive." There was a pause, and she heard something that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. "Still alive," he said. "Though the bugs are doing their best to change that. We lost contact with half the squad 10 minutes ago. I've got maybe 15 soldiers left, and 100 Skarn between us and the generator. Then fall back," she said, and she hated the desperation in her voice. "There must be another way." "There isn't," Marcus replied, and his voice was calm in a way that terrified her. "If we don't retake that generator in the next hour, the shield goes down and everyone dies. That includes you." "Your Highness, that's not something I'm prepared to let happen." She heard him give an order, heard the sound of weapons firing, heard a scream that cut off abruptly. "Marcus," she said, and she did not care who heard her use his name. "Please be careful. I'll do my best," he said. "But if I don't make it back, I need you to know something." "Don't," she said. "Don't say goodbye." "I forbid it." "Not goodbye," he said. "Just something I should have said before. You're the bravest person I've ever met, Your Highness. Not because you don't feel fear, but because you feel it and you stand anyway. That's what courage really is. That's what your people are going to need when this is over." The link went dead. Alendra stood frozen in the command center while the battle raged around her, and she felt something breaking inside her chest. He was going to die. He was going to die for her and her people. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. But there was something she could do. She had been taught since birth that the Volanti were telepaths, that their minds could reach across vast distances to touch other minds, that this gift was to be used for communication and communion, and never for anything else. But she was the daughter of emperors, the heir to 10,000 years of psychic bloodline, and her power was greater than any Volanti alive. She closed her eyes and reached out with her mind. She found him in the chaos of battle, his consciousness blazing like a torch in the darkness. Human minds were strange, hot and bright and turbulent in ways that Volanti minds never were, and touching his felt like pressing her hand against the sun. But she did not pull away. She sank into his mind and felt what he felt. She felt the pain of wounds that would have killed any Volanti, the exhaustion of a body pushed far beyond its limits, and beneath it, all something that burned brighter than everything else. Determination. It was not like anything she had experienced before. It was not hope or faith or courage, though it contained All of those things. It was something simpler and more primal. A refusal to stop that went beyond reason or logic. A stubbornness that would not accept defeat, even when defeat was certain. This was what made humans terrifying. This was what made them beautiful. She felt him sense her presence in his mind, felt his shock and confusion. And then she felt something she had not expected. She felt warmth and gratitude, and something deeper that he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. He cared for her, not as a duty or an assignment, but as a man cares for a woman. He had been fighting it, denying it, telling himself all the reasons why it was impossible and improper and wrong. But in this moment, with death all around him and her presence in his mind, the truth was undeniable. Alindra, he thought, and hearing her name in his mind was more intimate than any touch could ever be. You shouldn't be here. I am here. She thought back, and I am not leaving. Use my strength. Let me help you. She poured her power into him, all the energy she could spare, and she felt it flow into his exhausted body like water into parched earth. It would not heal his wounds or make him stronger than he was, but it would give him what he needed most. It would give him the will to keep going. Marcus Cole rose from behind his cover and charged the scar position. He moved like nothing human, faster and fiercer than should have been possible, and the scar fell before him like grain before a scythe. His soldiers followed him, inspired by his example, and together they pushed through the enemy lines with a fury that seemed to shock even the insects. The battle lasted 23 minutes. When it was over, the shield generator was back in coalition hands, and Marcus Cole was lying in a pool of blood with more wounds than any medical officer had ever seen on a living patient. His armor was gone, torn away by scarn claws, and his body was a map of destruction that made the hardened soldiers around him turn away in horror. But he was still breathing. His helmet camera had broadcast the entire assault, and every Volante on the planet had watched. As a single human and his handful of soldiers held the line against impossible odds. They had seen him fall and rise again, refusing to stay down, refusing to stop fighting, refusing to die. Alindra was already running when they brought him back to the palace, and she did not stop until she reached the medical bay where they had laid him. He was unconscious, barely alive, but when she took his hand, she felt his mind stir against hers. Did we win? He thought, and his mental voice was barely a whisper. The generator is secure, she replied. You did it, Marcus. You saved the city. Good, he thought. And she felt his consciousness fading. That's good. Tell Admiral Chung to use targeting data from the Northern Array. Coordinate with the Volante psychic network for precision strikes on the flagship. That's how we win this. Then he was gone, sinking into unconsciousness, and she held his hand while the medics worked, and the battle continued to rage in the sky above. The Skarn flagship was descending toward the capital Earth's fleet was crippled. Everything seemed lost, but Marcus had given them one last gift before the darkness took him. He had given them a plan now. It was up to the Volante to finish what he had started. The Grand Hall had become a refugee shelter, filled with thousands of Volante who had fled from the outer districts as the Skarn bombardment continued. The crystal walls that had once reflected celebration now echoed with the sounds of crying children and frightened whispers. And the beautiful architecture was cracked and scarred from the tremors of orbital strikes. Alindra stood at the center of the hall beside the unconscious form of Marcus Cole, who had been moved here when the medical bay became too dangerous. She had not left his side since they brought him in, and she held his hand even as the Volante elders gathered around her father to discuss surrender. We have no choice, Elder Valmorn was saying. The human fleet is destroyed. Our shields will not hold another hour. If we do not surrender now, the Skarn will kill every living being on this planet. And if we do surrender, the Emperor asked in a voice heavy with defeat, Then they will only kill most of us, the elder replied. Some will survive as slaves. It is the only option we have left. Alindra listened to this conversation with growing fury. She thought of Marcus lying beside her, of the wounds he had suffered, of the sacrifices his people had made. She thought of the soldiers who had died to give them this chance, of the ships that had burned in the sky, of the hope that had been purchased with human blood, and she thought of what Marcus had said to her in the garden, about how the Valanthi had forgotten what it meant to fight. She stood up. No, she said, and her voice rang through the grand hall with a power that silenced every conversation and turned every head. We will not surrender. Elder Velmorn looked at her with something between pity and contempt. Your Highness, with respect, you are young and do not understand the reality of our situation. We are not warriors. We cannot fight the Skarn. It is simply not in our nature. Then we will change our nature, Alindra replied. The humans taught us that strength is a choice, not a birthright. They showed us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand despite it. They came here to die for us, strangers who owed us nothing, because they believed we were worth saving. She walked to the center of the hall, stepping over refugees who moved aside to let her pass. And she climbed the crystal staircase until she stood where she had stood on the night of her coming-of-age ceremony. Looking down at her people, I watched a human soldier fight his way through 100 enemies to save this city, she said. I felt his mind when he should have been dead. And do you know what I found there? Not fear, not despair, but a refusal to stop. A determination that burned brighter than any star. Her glow intensified, the royal blue light that marked her bloodline blazing until it filled the hall. The humans call us a peaceful species, and they are right. We are peaceful because we chose to be, thousands of years ago. But we did not evolve past violence. We simply forgot it. And now, when our survival depends on remembering, we tell ourselves that we cannot. She looked at her father, at the elders, at the thousands of frightened faces turned toward her. I say we can, she declared. I say we must. The humans have given us time with their sacrifice. Now we must decide what we will do with it. Will we cower and surrender and watch our civilization become dust? Or will we stand and fight and show the galaxy what the Valanthi are truly capable of? For a long moment, no one spoke. Then a young technician stepped forward from the crowd. A woman barely older than Alindra, with luminescent skin that flickered with uncertainty. Your Highness, she said, I work in the power distribution center. We have always been told that our psychic networks are too delicate for weaponization, but I have studied the human targeting systems, and I believe I can create an interface. If we can coordinate our telepaths with their sensor data, we could guide precision strikes directly through the Skarn flagship shields. Another voice called out from the crowd. I am an engineer, a male Valanthi said. We have fusion reactors throughout the city that could be overloaded and weaponized. The Skarn do not know our infrastructure. We could turn our own technology into traps. More voices joined in, each offering skills and ideas that had never been considered before. The Valanthi had spent millennia developing their civilization, and now for the first time they were imagining how that civilization could be used to fight Emperor Veltharin. Watched his daughter with tears streaming down his ancient face. And when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. My daughter speaks the truth, he said. We have been cowards hiding behind our peace, and brave humans have died for our cowardice. No more. Today we remember what we forgot. Today we fight. The next 30 minutes were chaos, but it was purposeful chaos. Technicians worked feverishly to create the psychic sensor interface, while engineers identified reactor sites that could be turned into weapons. Every Valanthi with telepathic ability was connected to a growing network that spanned the entire capital. A web of minds working together for the first time in their history toward a common violent purpose. Admiral Chung, her face bloodied and exhausted from the battle above. Coordinated with Alindra through a communication link that crackled with interference. "The flagship is descending for a ground assault," the Admiral said. "They think we're beaten. If your people can really do what you're saying, we need to hit them the moment they lower their combat shields for troop deployment. We will be ready," Alindra said. "Your Highness," Chun said. And there was something like respect in her voice that had not been there before. "Marcus was right about you. You're something else." The Skarn flagship broke through the clouds above the capital, a massive ship that dwarfed the tallest spires of the palace. Its shadow fell across the city like the hand of death. And for a moment, every Volante felt the cold grip of despair, but only for a moment. Alindra stood at the center of the psychic network. Her mind connected to thousands of others, and she felt their fear transform into something else. It was not courage, not exactly. It was anger. It was rage at being threatened, at being hunted, at being told they were weak. It was the fire they had forgotten they possessed. Now, she commanded the 1,000 Volante minds, struck as one. The psychic pulse hit the Skarn flagship like a physical blow, guided by human sensor data to strike at the exact moment the shields dropped. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It was pure mental force channeled through millennia of evolution, and it tore through the insectoid hive mind that controlled the ship like a blade through water. Flagship began to fall at the same moment. Fusion reactors across the city detonated in precisely calculated sequences, creating a wall of fire that consumed the Skarn troops that had already landed. Engineers had turned the power grid into a weapon, and they wielded it with the precision that their species was known for. Skarn fleet, suddenly without their flagship and their hive mind coordination, fell into chaos. Human ships that had been playing dead suddenly came alive, hitting the confused enemy from unexpected angles. Volante orbital platforms, weaponized for the first time in their existence, added their fire to the assault. The battle lasted another 2 hours, but its outcome was decided in that first moment. The Skarn were broken, their invasion shattered. Their armada scattered across the system, and retreat Valanthos Prime had survived in the Grand Hall. Alindra collapsed to her knees as the psychic network dissolved, her body drained beyond anything she had experienced before. She had been the focal point of the attack, had channeled more power than any Volante in history, and it had cost her dearly, but she was smiling. A hand touched her shoulder, and she looked up to see a face she had feared she would never see conscious again. Marcus Cole stood over her, leaning on a medical support frame, his body wrapped in bandages, but his eyes were open and clear. "I saw what you did," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "The whole fleet saw it. You saved everyone." "I learned from the best," she replied, and she took his hand in hers. A stubborn human who refused to die around them. The Volante were emerging from their fear, looking at the sky where the Skarn fleet had been and finding only stars. They had fought, truly fought, for the first time in 10,000 years. And they had won. The Emperor approached his daughter and the human soldier who had changed everything. "The war is not over," he said. "The Skarn will return. But today, we have shown the galaxy something it has never seen before. Today the Volante stood with humanity, and together we were unbreakable." He looked at Marcus with eyes that held a new understanding. "Captain Cole," he said formally, "Earth has given us much. Soldiers, ships, time. But the greatest gift you have given us is the reminder of who we could be. For that, the Volante Dominion owes you a debt we can never repay." Marcus bowed, though the motion clearly pained him. "With respect, Your Majesty, you don't owe us anything. This is what allies do." Alindra stepped forward, still holding Marcus's hand, and turned to face the gathered crowd. Her people, who had called humans beasts and deathworlders and monsters, now looked at them with something entirely different in their eyes. Today I announce an eternal alliance between the Volanti Dominion and the humans of Earth, she declared. Not as master and servant, not as civilized and primitive, but as equals. Partners in the defense of all that is good in this galaxy. She turned to look at Marcus, as she did not hide what she felt for him. Let the court whisper, let the know.